Not yet. He saw them in the brittle light before the bell, crouched with colored sticks, tracing a rope of chalk from curb to curb. They were small as birds from where he stood at the tool cage, serious in a way that made their backs look older. A girl lifted her hand to blow chalk off the line, and the dust hung there, unpersuaded by the usual drift. He walked slow, broom across his shoulder, the cart with its squeak coming behind him. He did not ask the first question that came to mind, because children give better answers to second questions. "What game is it?" he said, squinting through the glare. They stopped and looked at him like he had called out across a river. The boy with the blue stick answered as if lessons had already been held. He said the groundskeeper shouldn't cross, not until the wind changed. The other hands fluttered warnings, small pale flags. Then they ran for the playground, barefoot, leaving their sticks and a stale sweetness in the air as if someone had cut open a bag of mothballs in the sun. He set his cart at the corner and leaned on the broom while the buses turned in their slow ceremony. Traffic made a polite river around the line, not from care, just habit. Chalk always means temporary. He watched until the rush thinned, and then walked the length of the curb to see if the line made sense. From one gutter to the other, a band across the lane where his morning crosswalk usually lived. There were smudges from shoes near the start, then nothing. Even the crumbled bits looked arranged. He could have stepped over with his one long leg, put his weight down where paint had faded and chalk, pretended at authority, but the small voice that used to belong to his mother told him to hold off and see what it intended. By the noon hour, the line had gathered its own order. Leaves dry as paper rolled in from the two drains and settled neatly along the chalk, as if a pane had been set just above the blacktop and all loose things had hit and decided to stay. The flag on the roof hung dull. Out by the maples, the air to the field side felt cooler, sharper, like the breath before rain. He started to sweep the curb, the way he always did after lunch, then noticed the sparrows. Everyone he could count sat on the far lawns like a dropped cloth, none crossing the asphalt. They hopped and fussed in their thick way, but no wing touched the street. He stood at the edge with the broom tapping the curb. Dust ran its small eddies that meant nothing and then meant something. Cars had passed. He had seen tires hurry and slow. The chalk should have given up. It did not. The line looked fresh, as if it had been laid a breath ago, as if someone had worked a wet finger along it. He leaned nearer without letting his boots slide, and the air answered him. It thickened right there, a cushion persuading sound down and away, like cotton laid inside the ear. On the field side, the grass rippled once toward him, a wave with no wind to shape it. He pulled the broom back, because his wrist began to itch with a worry that no salve fixes. At the end of the day, the children came back in the slant light, feet bare, hair damp at their necks. They held their elbows as if they were cold and watched the crowns of the trees. When he opened his mouth, they shook their heads, a hive of no. Not yet, one whispered, and he let the whisper settle because it was not meant only for him. The leaves gave a brief shiver that did not belong to breeze and stopped. The chalk held like something in a door, dividing the evening into two halves that refused to trade places. He told himself he had not lived long enough to earn a worry like this, and then remembered he had. He had known fogs that came inland wrong, black ice that looked like wet glass and laughed at boots, power lines that snapped in clean air. The world performs odd feats under its coat, and men do better when they behave like witnesses first. He checked his watch without reading it habit, not time, and went along the stacks to flatten the soccer nets before the night crept in and made them rectangles for animal use. The windsock near the bus loop hung with the same dullness as the flag. He tried to feel for movement and found none beyond his own breath. He did not step over the chalk. He went the long way, a petty humility that no one would praise him for. In the shed, he set the broom with its bristle tips neatly even and the rake where it is earned to lean. He washed his hands at the slop sink and watched the cold water come thin at first, then honest. He rubbed the creases of his palms as if grit could be worried out. When he returned to the yard with the last bag for the trash, the line had darkened a shade, like a path gone damp. That night, he sat by his small fan and ate food that did not need heat, because the kitchen gathered warmth differently when the days ran mean. He watched the news because men on the screen are paid to be not surprised. It gave him heat advisories, reminded him to watch for thunder that would not arrive until morning, ran old footage of a funnel in a county far west like an excuse to say the word. He listened to the fridge hum, a comfort he did not name out loud. He dreamed of children's hands fluttering in his doorway, their palms dusty, their eyes warning even as tired chins dropped to sleep. Next morning, he checked the curb before the buses. Dew had given its brief kiss and withdrawn. The chalk should have taken it hard. It should have blurred into the larger damp and vanished. It had not. It looked like paint takes to cold iron, a set that promises to outlive whatever holds it. He kept the crossing cones in the closet. He made a line, a breath wider with his stance and arm, and the old call he had employed. For a decade, that brisk rust careful, now watch your step, and nothing else because names told stories, and he did not have a safe one ready. Children of a certain age do not need counsel to treat a thing like a game. They came to the edge with the bell still far and toe-backed a brogue up to the chalk. They made jump sound without jumping. They laughed the way birds laugh. Then a girl with a gap in her teeth scooted backward on her heels and said no again in the same tone the night had used. Even the children who liked to take orders from no one looked down with proper gravity. They cut their own path around the end of the painted curb, 2 lines of little bodies clipping the grass. He felt pride in a thing he had not taught them, and then he questioned his pride, because perhaps the chalk deserved the credit, and he did not know yet whose side to be on. At midday, the first rumor came from inside. The principal's office whispered into his clip-on radio about a smell in one wing, and could he bring a fan? He went, machine on a dolly rattling floor tiles in a mild protest, and met the secretary at the hallway door, holding her sweater in a knot. The air felt wrong a step beyond the threshold, like a store after a freezer bank has lost power for a few minutes and regained it. He set the fan in the door and watched it start brave, blades trying for upright work, and then the push stuttered and gave out as if something prickled at it from the hall. He wheeled it back, let it try again, and the world allowed it for the open hall where teachers had hung paper apples and dry cornstalk garland. He did not say a thing from the night with the chalk to the woman who kept the day running. She had concerns enough. After school, he took the long broom and pushed a row of gravel back into shape along the edge where the mowing crew liked to pretend they could make clean lines with blades. He came to the chalk and stopped again. A car had crossed with lazy indifference during pickup, a rear tire dragging gum wrappers through. He expected the chalk to be grease now, smirched beyond dignity, but the tire track lay on top of the line like a fingerprint on glass. The chalk under it held its bright. He put down his broom and squatted, because you learn more about something from the ground. Up close, he saw small rings inside the chalk like they were layers. He had not made not a child's plan for a rainbow, but rings like a tree shows when you are cruel enough to find out its years. He did not touch it with a finger. His breath plumed a little in the late heat, saw nothing to condense on, and returned to him as if told to mind its manners. He had come to work here when his back was still a better promise than it had become. The town was right for him because the weather sat plain and the earth behaved if you asked with respect. In those first seasons, the worst trouble had been kids with time who wanted to throw each other into the hedges, and mowers that would not accept blade sharpening at the right angle. Then the small disasters began to stack into a kind of curriculum. He had cleaned up after a fall swarm of wasps, found a classroom ceiling like a damp cave, and made it their project. He had dried the brigade of floors when a pipe gave under a janitor's closet, with nobody inside to hear it suffer. He had walked out with a shovel at the end of a day when the clouds had lied to the county and a ditch took most of itself across a bus loop with terrible patience. None of those felt like this did, where there was no work to do but the work of not doing. On the grandstand of the far field, the band practiced their steps for a parade that would not come for a good long while. Drums spoke through the lamina of air like hearts unashamed. They kept to their side without being told. He watched a boy carry a tuba along the track and wondered if anyone had measured the effort of polite endurance required of a kid to walk in the heat for music they might not love. A call came in the late afternoon to wheel a mop bucket to the far bathrooms because the auto dispensers had rebelled and set soap free. He went because mops will always be his. He sloshed in, breathing stale citrus, and saw long pale islands of foam drifting toward the central drain, as if the room held a slow breeze he could not feel. On the mirror, someone had pressed a hand, and then more hands smudging to look like trees. He wrung the mop and watched the drips reach for the baseboard on one wall only, as if the other wall had worked up a magnetic joke. When he finished there, he found himself at the chalk again, and a boy watching the sky. The boy had the lined face given to children who stop eating when the world gets close. He wore sneakers without laces and a shirt with a team that never won. He stood on the far verge and squinted as if to reduce the world to manageable shapes. He asked the boy what had been drawn, and the boy said it had not been just drawing, then bit his lip because he had used a word that belonged to adults and should not have. He looked at the maples and said the wind would tell them when. He did not look at the line while he said it. He said a few names of friends in the whisper of a roster and included the word borrowed, as if the chalk had been a resource taken, not stolen. Do you know how to tell when wind changes? The groundskeeper asked. The boy nodded, put 2 fingers up in front of his mouth, like a flute, and left them there, the small focus of a trick made of breath. He turned his hand a fraction. He said the first sign would be the flags on the tetherball posts, not the big flag, because the big one liked to pretend. He said the smallest leaves would show their pale undersides like fish. He said the gravel along the edge would make a sound like tiny beads poured from a toy. The boy seemed sad for being good at it. He crossed his arms the way small kids do when they are older than they feel, and went to where the others were tracing something new with the side of their bare feet. By the 3rd day, the line had a shine on it in the midday, a sheen like sweat. The cooler air on one side strengthened a notch you could feel even when walking parallel. The room on the wrong half of the wing held it sour again, and then let it go as if ashamed of demanding attention. The secretary told him the principal had called a district man, and the district man would come, and he should be ready to show him whatever there was to show. The district man came wearing a shirt that performed hard work he had not done in years. He shook the groundskeeper's hand like a test. He looked at the chalk and laughed once, the way a foreman laughs when he sees a thing and remembers being like this himself, but on the side of relief. He walked right across, planting each foot as if to show the line who he had been. He did not feel it at first. Then his hair lifted at the temple with no breeze to speak of, and he rubbed at it, and he stopped without meaning to. He stood midline. He tried to make his face say what faces do when they are not surprised by anything a day can deliver. He stepped off and asked for a hose. The groundskeeper rolled it over, turned the spigot, and water translated itself from piping and went honest into the daylight. He handed the nozzle to the district man, who hosed the chalk with a neighborly malice, direct, blunt. Water sheeted off. A few chalk crumbs went small and slid into the lip near the curb. The line remained. The district man said he had seen weirder stuff. He walked over to the tetherball court and flicked a rusted buckle with his index finger and told a story about a school once where birds wouldn't land on Tuesdays. He wrote a note with a stiff pen. He told the principal to keep kids off it and call if it marched. He had other lines to see in other towns, he said. Not chalk, but lines of something that would interest him more. He left behind the smell of his cologne, the undertone of soap made for men who lived in cities, and a few words that sounded like shoulders being lifted and set down. A printed advisory came through the office then, the kind that looks official even when it says very little. Out of an abundance of caution, it said. A temporary perimeter, it said, until staff could evaluate. The groundskeeper saw himself in this small paragraph, seen as useful, shown where to place cones, asked to make a few signs with the laminator. He made them clean, with the serif font he trusted, not the playful one teachers enjoyed when they wanted forgetting. He put the cones at a distance that felt like a courtesy. He pulled a strip of plastic and looped it from cone to cone so the sign would have a friend. In the late afternoon, a pickup from the firehouse tugged into the lot, and two men came out wearing T-shirts that explained their days. They did not bring the little meter he expected. They brought coffee and a box of donuts and asked him if he wanted one. He wanted half and took a whole, because the world praises appetite even when it is about the wrong things. They stood a respectful step from the line and talked about nothing. One said the county had got a few calls from folks who could not get their compost piles to smoke, and then an old woman who was certain the wind had gone to live inside her house and would not leave. They were careful not to say the woman's name. He said the chalk did not belong to the district. He said it would be gone with weather. He said this in the tone a man uses when he knows he is due to be wrong. On the fourth evening, he walked to the edge with his broom and watched the street split itself in the low amber. Traffic fell off. A lone sedan nose-inched, then gave up and reversed. The chalk had been retouched by someone. As hands he could see fresh passes laid over old, and the ends held shapes now. A hook on one curb, a little square on the other, as if measuring had been done from both sides. He wanted to obliterate it, to take his steel brush and scrub until his shoulder gave. He didn't. He looked toward the trees the way the children had, and waited without wanting to admit that that is what he was doing. A small wind came, but could not decide where to go. It slid a little along the back of his neck, and then tucked itself away again like a shy animal. Leaves on the far side flashed their undersides with a blink, and went correct. The tetherball flags took no notice. The gravel stayed indifferent. He watched until the light moved so low it rolled under his attention, and the chalk took the shade like it had been put there, not drawn. That night, the refrigerator hummed twice, and then went quiet, not wrong, not failing, only choosing to be still on a rhythm that made him notice. The fan on his dresser did a short cough and settled without coming up to speed. He lay and listened to the building as if waiting for words. When they came, they did not belong to a building. They belonged to leaves a street away, making a river noise and then stopping midstream. He slept in those stops, left the radio off because no voice of his own could sit on top of another man's calm and win. Children have better memories for small rules than the adults who pretend to make them. They kept away from the line like they would from a bee's nest hung too low on a field branch, curious and obedient in equal measure. One boy threw a foam ball, and the ball crossed without drama, landed on chalk and rolled a fraction, and then lay there as if caught by a lip his eyes had not seen. He jogged around to pick it up, and when he put a foot on the asphalt, he paused and then stepped back without knowing why his body had chosen to. He plucked the ball from the street with a pinch and brought it to the far side to his friends, as if delivering a small animal. The teachers did what teachers do when anything odd makes their job look like it has not prepared them for this exact chapter. They smiled and watched for boldness. They sent a few kids to library who did not need sending. They kept their eyes bright and said it would go in the science journal they did at the end of the week. The vice principal came out with a clipboard and wrote without looking down. The head custodian from the next school sent a message that said he had seen worse and to get rope. Another older custodian sent a wry line about not sweeping ghosts. He put his phone back in his pocket and kept his thumb off the screen. The high cloud that had been caught over the town slid just enough by the fifth day for the sun to burn through white and make the shadow of the school hard and mean. He walked the playground trash and found less than usual because the children had been handing him wrappers like offerings whenever he went by. He thanked them as if he were a priest, hands open for receipts and caps, making small jokes about too much sugar and the virtue of appeal. He arrived at the chalk and found something he had not seen. Ants lined up along the white, their bodies moving brisk in no particular hurry. A procession that would have looked planned if he had been a man who believed insects could hold a meeting. They carried nothing. They touched the line with their feelers at small intervals, and then went back to the nest side with more purpose than fear. He crouched and watched until the sun taught him to stand. The second advisory from the district came with more words to fill the same space. It said the district had engaged appropriate specialists. It mentioned the boundary without calling it chalk. It talked about respect and safety and the patience of a town that had always understood the difference between spectacle and problem. It asked parents to pick up their kids a block further out. It asked that no one bring drones. It asked in such a way as to sound sure everyone had already thought to. After the bell that sent the last wave home, he stationed himself near the end of the line just to be present in case. Parents with dogs paused and pretended to check their phones and then moved on. A man in a suit stood and read the signs like they might transform into something better if he acted as if he had rights. A truck with a ladder rack rolled slow, then laughed with its engine and went. In all that time, the leaves on the far side did not give their pale again, and he began to suspect that night would need another evening to teach him whatever it was trying. He went home to his little table and the small evening news and the same set of fries uneaten from yesterday and the sound of a neighbor playing the same 3 chords on a guitar that wanted to belong to a better player. He ate the fries and thanked the god of salt for doing that work. He switched off the light and let the room be its degree of dark. In the middle of the night, he woke to quiet on the other side of the wall, a quiet that meant the neighbor had stopped playing without choosing to stop, as if the guitar had gone slack. He lay until the quiet grew normal. In the morning, he found the neighbor on the stoop, looking at his own hands, his face soft. A man said he had dropped the pick and then had not felt like bending. On the 6th day, it rained over the township to the north and sent clean, cool downwind without a drop for them. The air tasted like tin, and the smell of wet roads came without any of the wet. The line held neat as a seam. He walked the length and touched one finger to the chalk near the little square. The chalk gave a grit to his fingertip and a slickness, like paper that had been sealed and unsealed, and something in the prick of his skin made him think of the smell of certain old basements. He wiped his fingertip on his pants with more care than he would have used if it had just been dust. In the afternoon, a van with a university logo on the door pulled up, a logo that always looks expensive even when painted on a tired vehicle. 2 people climbed out in coats too nice for the work. They wheeled a case and took measurements with little tube devices held up like lighters to the air. They spoke in a language of carbon and ions and words that sound like kindness until you have to sit with them. He did not get near to listen. He watched from the doorway of the shed and made himself forget the names of the tools they brought. You get through things sometimes by becoming unlearned for a day. They asked a few questions of the principal that floated to him on the dressing air, a tone that said this would be fodder for a paper, and then for a grant, and then for a new paper. They smiled at the chalk like it was a prank they needed to sound modest about. They poured a line of water across, slowly, to see what it would do. They measured the droplet incline with a little digital level that chirped. He wanted to ask them if they owned any real rakes, just to know if their hands had ever served something under dirt. He did not ask. He watched the leaf edges lift in that shy way, and the gravel arranged itself into small ridges, and he was ashamed to have taken so many years to see it so well. That evening, the children returned again, barefoot, watching. A smaller girl he recognized from cafeteria. Help Days held a stick of purple chalk that had been worn down to a nub. She stood by the little square at the curb and waited. After a long time, after the light turned from gold to a shade that belonged to late summer, after the world had said no for the length of a prayer, she knelt and wrote something there, not very big. He could not see it. She stood and walked away without looking back at what she had done. He took one step to see. He did not take another. The word was a name he knew, but had not heard anybody say in a long time, and he knew he should leave it alone until it scraped itself into the gutter on its own. Parents began sending their concerns to the office. This he learned secondhand in the way the secretary sighed when she printed her stack, and the way a teacher leaned crooked in his doorway and said with an attempt at cheer that if this wasn't over soon, someone would shout indoors. You could tell the town would reframe it soon with a story. When people cannot fix, they lift a thing into myth, or they turn it into blame. He had lived long enough to respect both hobbies. He dreamed that night of an empty gym with all the chairs set with their backs facing the wrong direction. He walked between rows that had no aisle, his broom a cane, the varnished floor giving back his reflection wrong in a pleasant way. He woke thinking he had heard the maples outside his window cough. He sat up and listened to a house decide whether it could drop one creak, and changed its mind. He lay back down so his heart could rest. On the 7th morning, the chalk looked thinner, but the feeling had deepened. The cool edge on the field side had worked itself a little toward the center of the road. He would have taken the line for an old river course if he had not watched it drawn. He set the cones and felt foolish for trusting plastic. He told himself to stop feeling and keep the day moving. He went inside to tighten a hinge on the kitchen door, and the door refused to squeak with its usual gratitude. Every small thing said quiet at once. He moved his hands as if they were expensive. He needed them to belong to him a while yet. The district man came back with a crew that ran a strip of white paint parallel to the chalk at a distance meant to comfort parents who believe in paint. They called it a temporary marking. They brought out a sawhorse and set a sign. The chalk line now had a cousin more official looking. The chalk did not care. He had the sense the chalk had never cared. He stood with a coil of caution tape in his hand and felt every twist of it like rope-burning skin that has never seen sun. He jammed the end onto a cone and strung it the length of the block. Drivers nodded. A child reached for it and did not take it. He ate lunch alone in the shade of the electrical box. The turkey sandwich from the machine had a taste of stale air no amount of mustard could fix. He ate it anyway because he did not trust himself to stand up without eating. He drank water from a bottle gone warm and felt it sit heavy in his stomach without giving any news to his head. He wiped the angle of his mouth, the way old men do, and wished he could call himself something else. A storm rose as the afternoon fell. He felt it before the office radio clicked to life with the principal saying the words they always say to end a day early without making it sound like a failure. He set out. The sky gathered itself into promising shapes and then chose the slightly lesser drama. Thunder went his way with modesty, and the first drops hit the blacktop in that pattern he had loved since childhood. When you could watch circles of water arrive and join, first with courtesy, then with the impatience of true rain. He waited for the chalk to wash. He waited a long time. The rain came clean, fat, and kind, and the chalk took it like a blessing and held. He sat on the step under the roof and let himself smile, because you must smile sometimes, even if you do not earn it. The rain knocked at the cones and shined the tape. Cars hissed by and stayed respectful. Children ran with jackets lifted over their heads the way girls did and boys did, and he had done all his life. He did not envy them, except for the part of him that missed running without purpose. In the last light before the whole town turned lamps on, the line gave up a fraction. He watched the chalk thin to a suggestion, then to memory, then to nothing. The place where it had been held in order, as if the chalk had not been the only thing dividing the street. Leaves still made that neat row along where white had been. The air on the field side kept its cool. The grass did its coy ripple, himward. He made a note in his pocketbook that said rain, then another word he could not read later because his hand had found a speed it had forgotten, and the letters had become their own language. In the morning, only the paint remained, the fresh official stripe 2 broom lengths off where the chalk had been. He ran the broom along the curb and made a clean edge of grit because work still had to be done. He tightened the tape because parents still needed to see order. He stood and listened to the mowers out on the far practice field, and to the high drone of the one child who liked to sing down a hallway, and to the ice maker in the kitchen. He walked to the middle and stood on the place where the chalk had lived, and the air made his ears feel like a plane had just started its climb, and then decided on mercy and leveled. That was when he knew the chalk had not been the thing. The chalk had been the admission of the thing. He made a private decision he did not share with the principal, or the district man, or the children, or the clerk who had handed him the paper cups he needed for the cooler every morning. He decided he would be the one to test the wind every evening, along the little angle of road where the line had sat. He would stand with his broom, or without it, and let the air explain itself. If it went easy, he would go easy. If it held its cotton, he would hold off too. A man does not have much power, but he has some authority over his own foot. That first evening he took to his post, and the air held still as if tired of lessons. He watched the leaves for the palest underside. The tetherball flags refused to move. The gravel lay. He stood until the town took on that strange hush that comes just before the dinner hour, when everyone is inside except the few who are unclaimed by the meal. He went home and found his fridge hum again, like a friend who had stayed away too long. On the second evening he went again, and the air had worked up a little edge like laughter held in a pocket. The leaves flashed their pail and went back, and the gravel made a sound like a small spoon tapped twice against glass. He found himself smiling and was not proud of what he felt. He had been chosen as a keeper for a day, and that choosing had made his back feel less like a grudge. On the third evening he heard it before he reached the curb. The sound did not come from flags or gravel. It came from children's breath in the trees, a collected hush. They were there ahead of him, bare feet, hands dusty, watching the crown. They did not look at him, but the smallest girl tilted her chin down, as if to say that grown men were useful to have at the periphery. He watched the first slender twigs lift. He watched the grass ripple toward him in that single wave that belonged to no wind. He felt the cool cross his shins. In that minute, the chalk could have been written in the air. He took one step back without deciding to. "Not yet," she whispered. He obeyed. The air leaned. The sound cottoned. The world split into polite halves, not warring, not even arguing, only declining the trade. He stood with his broom like a man on a dock, watching a boat come in that did not have his name on it. He stood until his legs spoke, and then he went to the shed without turning his head to, the side where the air still held its sharp. There would be more advisories, then fewer. The district man would send a note one morning full of words about normal operations and a plan for monitoring. The band would march their pattern out along the far field. A parent would stop him in the hall and ask if he had cleared the chalk, and he would say it had rained and feel ashamed of his answer because it skimmed the surface of a thing that had depth. The university van would come one more time with new tubes, and then not at all. The ants would move back to carrying, to their work of taking things apart, small piece by small piece, and carrying them under the earth, where other rules prevailed. The flag would shout in a later front, and then hang again like laundry. But in the evenings, when the shadows of the maples lay like riverbeds across the street, he would go to the place where the chalk had been and take his reading. He would stand and let the air tell him what it was ready to be, and the children would come sometimes, not always, and stand barefoot and watch the trees and say not yet when the town needed them to. On one evening late, when the heat had pulled all worth out of the day, the smallest girl would look at him and tilt her head toward the far side, and he would put his foot to the line that was no longer a line, and the air would admit him to itself without fight, and then push him back like water, as when you walk into the shallow and there is a small shelf, and he would step away and feel stupid and blessed. He understood then that the line was a courtesy the world had extended. It meant to show its seam. He thought of old work shirts that give back the line where a seam has been let and re-sewn. He thought of a scar on his knee where a pocket knife he should not have trusted had folded against him and left him with a memory. He thought of the way a field is kept by fences, even when the wire sags and the posts lean. He did not look for reasons. He was too old for reasons. He did not need to call it a front or a fault or a prank of air. He needed to be careful and steady for the hour it took to hand the day back to the night. Near the end of the month, when the light began to leave each evening a fingerprint sooner the air, gathered itself along that seam one last time in a way that made even the slowest talker walking home with a bag of rolls from the bakery pause and put a hand to the chest where people keep their yes. He held his broom and kept his distance. The leaves with their pale undersides flashed and held, and for a long breath the whole line of trees showed their pale like a school of fish turning at once. The gravel gave its sound. The tetherball flags did their whatevers, late as always. Then the wind, whatever it had been hiding, changed. It changed not with violence, but with a sigh that belonged to a clean house at the end of a long day. The sharp on the field side moved into the street and kept moving, and heat went with it, and the chalk that was no longer chalk did not have to hold anything anymore. The seam closed without pretending there had been no seam. The smallest girl put down her chalk nub very carefully, as if it could bruise, and walked to sit on the curb and look up at the sky with the forgiving eyes of someone who had been right without enjoying it. The boy with the blue stick that had become a blue smear on his palm took a breath like he had refused breath for an hour, and then laughed once with his mouth closed, a sound that would have offended a teacher for being private laughter. The groundskeeper leaned his broom against his thigh and let his hands rest on the top of it, and in that posture a man assumes when he is not sure whether he has finished or only paused, he could feel the evening he had been given to keep slide past him and go on to find someone else who needed reminding. At dawn he swept where the chalk had been and did not chase the last little caked bits into the drain. He let the leaves lie and let the sparrows land where they pleased. He watched the flag find its old habit. He went inside and tightened a loose hinge on a door he had tightened too many times before, and heard it give its correct small complaint. He took his first cup of coffee standing up, because he always took the first standing, and listened to the building wake itself. Somewhere a radio learned its volume again. Somewhere a teacher's laugh returned to its old pitch. He took the cones up from the curb, one at a time, and returned them to the closet. He hung the tape on a nail that had been set to hold it. He rolled the sign back into the shed. He left the paint, because paint would be paint. Now and again that winter, he would wake in the small hours to a quiet that felt held, and sit a while to see if the house would give him back its home. It always did, after a minute. On days when the wind came from the side of the country that brought clean cold, he would walk the curb and think he felt the seam again, like a faint raised line under a shirt, only to find himself laughing at his own nerve. In spring new chalk from small hands would come to the asphalt to draw dragons and daisies and hot boxes, and he would admire them and water them with the hose when the children were ready for the drawing to go. And sometimes he would see a lying maid with more gravity than play, and he would ask what game, and a child would tell him not to cross until the wind changed. He would stand in a step back and watch the leaves for their pale sides, and he would keep his broom tucked against his shoulder like a man at rest, and he would let the day decide whether to divide itself or not.